I really love the theme, choosing to challenge. It kind of feels like that could be my personal mantra. It feels like that's what I've done most of my life. When I was a young girl growing up in Mount Isa, I would have been about 3 or 4. The first time I ever saw a drummer play in a band, and I knew I'm going to play drums. But when I shared this with my family, my mum and dad said, "Don't be silly, Joanne. Girls don't play drums." But I continued, so I would, make little drum kits around the house and say, "See, girls can play drums. I'm playing drums." No. But I did persist. I chose to challenge that notion of what a girl can't do. So when I was 16 and a half, I went to Brisbane to the National Academy of Rudimental Drummers. I had won a scholarship for 12 months study, but this was eye-opening. This was an entirely male school, and they were less than thrilled to have a young girl join them. But again, I chose to challenge that. And the way I challenged that was I worked twice as hard as them. When they went home of an afternoon, I was still there. I would be there late into the night practicing and practicing and practicing till I got things down. So at the end of that 12-month scholarship, I then was faced with, well, how do I support myself? So my teacher said, the obvious choice, Jo, you play in a band. But he suggested I not play in one band, but find work as a casual drummer, doing casual gigs. I'd get more experience. This was the 70s in Brisbane, yeah? I am that old. So it was a very male industry. And on any given Saturday night in the Brisbane region, 1,400 bands played, but not one had a female drummer. So initially, I would turn up to play with my lovely drum kit with Joanne on the front, and I looked immaculate, and the band would be setting up, and they go, "No, you're a girl. Girls can't play drums, go home. We need a boy. We got a big sound here." So I'd feel, and I'd go home. But eventually, my teacher said to me, "We've got to look at this differently. So how about this? Take the name off. We'll just call you Jo." So I became Jo. So I would go early in the afternoon and set up long before the band got there, and I'd disappear. And then I was kind of cruel. I would turn up at about, if the gig was to kick off at 8, I'd turn up at about 10:02. And I could see them truly sweating, where's the drummer? But 5:02, I would rock up and say, "Hi, I'm Jo. I'm your drummer." Oh, I'd get a whole mouthful about, "We've got a big heavy rock sound, we can't have some slip of a girl, no one will hear you." And I would say, "Well, how about you give me the first bracket, and if you're not happy, I'll get you a new drummer." But, we really do have to kick off. And I never got sent home after that. Some of them begrudgingly decided that I played pretty good for a girl. But that's okay. At about the same time, my teacher had decided to record a record, and I was on the A side doing a drum solo, and he wanted to do this because he could see that as a woman, I was kind of up against it with the boys. And he thought that the record would help to launch my career. So there was a couple of television appearances, and there was a newspaper story that came out, I think, about a Wednesday. And that Saturday night, I was working a one-off gig with a band I didn't know for a wedding. So we were to kick off at 8. So I did the usual, in early, packed up, sneaky, 5 to 8, "Hi, I'm Jo." Usual story. Anyway, away we went. Now, these guys weren't bad people, okay? They're challenged by someone who they felt did not deserve to be in that role. So that particular night, there were a number of people who did recognise me from the newspaper story. And as the night wore on, I was uncomfortable with some of them in the way that they were behaving towards me. And the night finished about 1:45 in the morning. And I asked the guys in the band if they would just hang back until I packed all my gear up and got it out through the back of the hotel and into my car. And the bass player, I'll never forget what he said. He looked at me and he said, "Well, doll, packing up is all part of playing drums. That's why girls can't play drums." So I packed up, got my car, gear out to the car, and was in the process of packing my car when 3 of the men who were in the bar, who had been making sexual comments about me as a drummer, appeared out of the dark. It's a night that's burned into my memory. Those 3 men raped and bashed me, and I was left unconscious in the car park. But again, I chose not to be challenged by their actions. I was not going to be defined by one moment in time. So after a couple of months, I really recall very clearly the morning that I decided I would go back to the school and complete my studies. And on the way to the school, I stopped at a church, I don't even know which church it was, and I lit a candle, and I made a vow. I will never speak of this, and I will get on with my music career, and I will work. So for the next 4 years, I stayed in the music industry, which was harrowing, because every time I played, I thought I'd see their faces somewhere. The fear was with me 24/7. It cast a long shadow on my life for many, many years. After 4 years, I decided I needed a break, I needed to make money, so I went home back to the Isa to my parents, and I had this great plan. I'm going to get a job, and I'm going to go back and buy a car and finish my studies. But you know what they say about the best made plans of mice and men? Yeah, not so much. So I met Greg, got married, new direction. So I very quickly wanted to have a family, but after quite some time of trying, I was told that you will never be a mother. Motherhood is not for you. I challenged that as well. I chose to challenge. What does it mean to be a mother? Does motherhood just mean that I produce a child that looks like me? No. I didn't think so. Not to me. That's not just motherhood. Motherhood was about not necessarily what grew under my heart, but in it. So my husband and I decided to adopt from Sri Lanka. Now, this was the 80s. This was not something the Department of Children's Services was fond of. So they were very fond of throwing all sorts of obstacles. But nevertheless, in 1984, we flew to Sri Lanka, went to court to adopt our first child, Roshan. He was just 10 weeks old, just beautiful. And then we came home and reapplied to adopt again. And this was much more difficult because I'm not sure if you're aware, but at that time there was a civil war in Sri Lanka. It had gone on for a very long time. But by 87, it had ramped up considerably. So it was a very fearful moment to walk up the stairs of the plane with my 3-year-old son heading to a war zone. And friends were saying to me, I couldn't do it, but I couldn't not go. I had to go and get my son. He was waiting. And so we brought back Luxury. He was 2.5, perhaps. We don't really know. Lots of challenges with a child that suffered severe malnutrition to the point of being in a coma, maternal deprivation. And I recall a paediatrician saying to me, I think I would have left him there. I don't think you'll overcome the challenges. But I knew I would, because I knew love would rise and love would carry us across. And it has. He's just delightful. And thanks to him, I'm now a grandma. To the beautiful Penny. Yeah. So at that time, we moved to a small community, a very small community of just a little over 1,000 people. Never really experienced racism in my life until that moment, where this community was far from welcoming and thought that we were somewhat of an oddity with our 2 black children. So many invitations were issued for children to come and play with my children, but it would have been 10, 11 months before anyone responded and came to play. There were lots of pushback. One that I will share that was particularly challenging. It was really hot, December, and this is not long after we had come home from Sri Lanka with Luxury. He didn't have any English. He was struggling to settle in. So I said, let's go to the pool. So we were in the town pool, and the manager came and said, I'm sorry, you're going to have to get out of the pool. So I got my sons and myself out, and I said, what's the problem? And she said, we've had complaints. And I said, what do you mean complaints? Like, I know I swim badly, but really? You know, is it complaint worthy? And she said, people have complained that your children could be spreading infection in the pool. I was very upset, yes, and I was challenged by that. But I chose to challenge that, not by confronting it in a confrontational way, but a realization came to me late one night, almost as if it came out of the dark, that the way to help that would be to help that community see the power of community, that a community is made up of lots of individuals, and if you like, each individual is a cell in the body of humanity, and every cell is needed. So the way I practically went about that was to get involved with preschool committees, kindy committees, and it so happened I was on preschool committee. We needed to raise money. So I suggested an international food fair, and everyone went, oh, that won't work, you're the only international ones here. So I suggested that all of us have come from somewhere. We've all come somewhere. So that I talked to the teacher and said, how about we get kids to go home and ask Mum and Dad, you know, where do we come from? Where do our family come from? And sure enough, out came all sorts of things that my family came from Poland, and mine came from Malta. So we had an international food fair, raised a shit ton of money, and had a great night. But the important thing about it was that the community came together to work together for a cause. So we stayed in that little community for about 6 years, and every Saturday night we used to have open house. So I cooked curry, and anyone was welcome to come. And we had lots of curries and conversations, and I hoped that I was feeding their body curry, but their mind a vision of a community that's bigger, that embraces everyone, regardless, that everyone is here for a reason and everyone matters. So my husband's work brought us to Townsville in 1991, and then in 1994, I was pregnant with the child that you're never going to have. What? My first thought was, shit, I'm too old. But, you know, that's it. And then at exactly 9 weeks and 3 days into my pregnancy, I sat one morning for my morning meditation, and I had a vision of myself giving birth. And somebody lifted that little baby up, and I could see it was a little girl, and I could see that she had Down syndrome. And I knew what I was seeing was right, not just because of what I saw, but really more because of how I felt. I felt, the best way to describe it is like an unbelievable sense of stillness and peace. So I knew this is the baby I'm supposed to have. But the medical fraternity have very different understandings about the babies that you should have. So I had a lot of pressure to terminate and try again for a normal child. What is perfect? What does a normal child look like? What would that be? So on the 4th of September 1994, Emma was born at 32 weeks. She faced, 24 hours later, she had to have major surgery to repair her bowel. A few hours after that surgery, Emma crashed and had to be resuscitated. So they brought her back to intensive, brought me into intensive, and I'm sitting beside her oscillate, literally willing my daughter to stay. Hang on, you will have a great life. And I kept rambling and talking to her about what that good life would look like and how much I loved her, how much her brothers wanted her to come home. And a nurse approached me and said, "Jo, I just need to let you know that the medical team have advised that if your daughter crashes again, we will not resuscitate her." And I said, "What?" And they said, looked at me like I had two heads and said, "She's got a disability." And for me, I chose to challenge that on that spot. And I sat in the intensive care unit for 7 hours beside my daughter and said, "I will not leave until I get an assurance from you that you will keep my daughter alive. I want my daughter to live." She did. So my thinking at the time for Emma was that I wanted Emma to have a good life. What does a good life mean? And there's actually a lot of research around a good life. So, you know, a stable home, financial security, people who love you, friends, work. I wanted her to have all those things. So I was very much wanting Emma to be included in just regular things, not special, but regular. This was the early 90s. Inclusion was not big then. So wherever I tried to go, we did get a lot of pushback, but I did get her into many places. School was very challenging at that time as well. At the end of Emma's schooling, and at the end of year 12, teachers were having a lot of discussions about, you know, what's Emma going to do when she leaves school? And I used to just say, off the top of my head, she's going to haircut and get a real job. And they said, Jo, that's not realistic. She has got massive communication challenges and her disability is severe. She is never going to be able to work. You need to accept that. And I said, I will not. Because I believe in the power of possibility, that if you believe it's possible, and then so too it shall be. So Emma finished school and I went to a couple of disability employment providers who reiterated pretty much what the school had said. But in 2014, I helped Emma to craft a small business, shredding confidential documents. In 2015, she got a legal firm. That legal firm opened the door for another firm, who opened the door for another company. So today, Emma is working full-time in her business and has a great life. But I was looking at the lives of my sons as a role for where her life would go. So when my boys grew up and left school and took on apprenticeships, they were like all kids. You know, they're awkward, they're clumsy, like boys. They lose the power of speech, can't answer in anything but a grunt. It's true. But eventually they took on apprenticeships, their skill set grew, their confidence grew, their networks grew. And eventually they finished that, they completed their apprenticeships, and they went beyond the household gate, out to become their own magnificent selves. And I wanted that for Emma. So in 2017, she moved into a rental and had a ball. Who knew my daughter loved a beer? Not me. Imagine my surprise to see a picture sent to me of Emma out chugging, and the caption is, "That's her third." I'm like, slow down, you know. Have a good time, but only so much of a good time. But in 2018, she moved into her own property. She's travelled overseas twice. She has travelled to around the country having wonderful holidays. And Emma's life is built on self-determination and the right to choose, the right to have control of your own life, which is what all of us want. And so right now, Emma's exploring some other things, like she's got this idea that she'd like to be an extra in a movie or in a commercial. So we're looking at how that might happen. But the point here is that she has a good life to choose for herself. So that has very much been, my life has been about choosing to challenge the things that have come to my path. Each of the things that have come to my path have been perfect for me, even though they didn't seem it at the time. A number of years ago, I read a book by a man called John Perkins, and he was sharing his stories of spending time in the rainforest of the Amazon with some very traditional tribes. And he had formed a great bond with a shaman. And he took that shaman to the US to speak to people. And in one of those little workshops, a person stood up and asked him how he thought his people would save the world. And this quiet little shaman said, "It won't be my people. It will be middle-aged women from the West who will change the world." Yeah? So if we look at our world right now, we don't have to look very far. We just have to look to our nation's capital for some fine, upstanding examples. Now, we could choose in this moment to be angry, to rage about that. Or we can choose to sit quietly and watch in the sisterhood as the strong, powerful energy of the feminine rises. And she is rising. Not out of hatred, not out of revenge or anger, but with love. And I believe that is how the world will change. Thanks very much for listening.